Last week, an FDA panel rejected MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. The reasons why offer us a cautionary tale. Welcome to the Carlat Psychiatry Podcast, keeping psychiatry honest since 2003. I'm Chris Aiken, the editor-in-chief of the Carlat Psychiatry Report, and our co-host Kelly Newsome is on vacation today. 10 years ago, CBS aired an MDMA-assisted therapy session of a woman with PTSD on its medical talk show, The Doctors. We're going to play that for you right now because, based on last week's vote at the FDA, this may be the only time you're going to get to hear of this therapy, at least in the U.S.
What you're about to see is something very private. It's very personal. Rachel has agreed to share this. In this video, she's under the effects of MDMA. This is when she said she had a breakthrough in her ability to trust and connect with people again. Let's take a look.
I couldn't keep up or...
Oh, this is so great.
Mm-hmm.
Annie,
So see how we can both have fears?
Annie, our fears are dancing between us.
Yeah.
They're making art.
Mm-hmm. They're out in the open running around. Right?
Oh, God. That is so healing.
Instead of holding us down.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for starting it. You started that little flame dance.
Oh, my God. It feels so wonderful to be with you right now. Just to be... And I appreciate you sharing
And
with
notice
me.
Notice who started that.
Me?
Wow.
It's a little different than you thought it would be, right? It's not a party. It's hard work. But the medicine makes it so much easier.
You can watch that video on YouTube, and if you did, you'd see a wide-eyed woman lying on a sofa, her therapist seated close by. Her facial expressions are intense and her emotions rich and spontaneous, radiant, with a sense of wonder as if she has just discovered a long-lost treasure. That is one view of psychedelic-assisted therapy, but it's not the only one. We're going to tell you about another video from 2014, the same year, and this one is disturbing. It involves the MDMA dosing sessions in the MAPS clinical trials, the ones that got submitted to the FDA, of a woman with PTSD from a past sexual assault. The woman is sitting in bed, shaking, uncomfortable. She is surrounded by two therapists, a married couple, Drs. Donna Dreyer and Richard Jensen. Dr. Dreyer is a psychiatrist, and Dr. Jensen is a veteran psychedelic researcher and therapist. As the patient starts to shake, the male therapist, Dr. Jensen, suggests that she spread her legs, while his wife takes her hand. In the second session, the patient is much more distraught, crying in a panic. The male therapist is spooning her on the bed and sometimes lying on top of her between her legs while his wife offers blankets and support. In the last scene, both therapists are coddling and spooning her in bed, telling her that it's okay. That video was created as a kind of safety monitoring during the MAPS clinical trial, but things got much worse after the trial ended and the cameras were turned off. The patient moved to a remote Canadian island so she could continue the work of psychedelic healing with the two therapists in the video, the ones that she started with in the trial. At that time, she alleges that Richard Jensen began making sexual advances to her, telling her that it was a form of exposure therapy that would help her heal from past sexual traumas. She was given other drugs like ketamine and alleges that the therapist often demanded sex while she was in an intoxicated state. It was a slow process that tore away her defenses when she was already in a vulnerable place, and in 2019, the patient filed a sexual assault complaint with the Canadian police. Quote, "I was seduced, drugged, raped, blamed, and held as a sex slave for nearly 2 years," she says. MAPS, the nonprofit group that ran these trials, didn't report this incident at first. They did so only after it came to light through New York Magazine. The patient turned the video footage into the magazine, which it featured in season 1 of their cover story podcast called Power Trip. It's the source for some of our reporting here today, and I highly recommend the episodes. The media coverage has portrayed Richard Jensen, the male therapist, as an unlicensed therapist working at a low level in the MAPS trial. But this is not the case. Richard might be unlicensed in Canada, but he has practiced psychedelic therapy since the 1970s as a licensed psychologist. He has directed institutes and taught at Harvard and Johns Hopkins universities. He helped develop MDA, a predecessor of MDMA, and lectured on how to avoid boundary violations during MDMA therapy. He is a giant in the field of psychedelic therapy. He's someone who helped develop many of the therapeutic techniques in use today. Someone whom the U.S. FDA has trusted with drug permits for investigational studies of LSD. The incident caused Jensen's wife to surrender her medical license as a psychiatrist. Both she and Jensen have acknowledged that the sexual relationship occurred, although Jensen argues that it was consensual. Lawsuits are underway, but I'll point out that most believe that a consensual sexual relationship between a therapist and their patient is not possible because of the power differential that exists. That's the way the law is written in many states, including California, and that is even more true when psychedelics are involved, as these drugs put people in a vulnerable state, wearing down their boundaries and their will to say no. MDMA carries further risks, as this drug creates intimate feelings of love and trust. The boundary violation loomed large in the FDA advisory panel's decision to nix MDMA, but it wasn't the only reason. We'll get into that more in this 2-part series. But first, an introduction to MDMA, what this drug is. And we're going to intersperse some clips here from a recent interview I did with Owen Muir, a psychiatrist who co-authored a series of recent papers on psychedelics. Dr. Muir has no conflicts of interest with the psychedelic industry and has also declared that he has never tried these drugs himself. I join him in that distinction. This interview was done in May 2024, before the FDA panel's decision was out.
MDMA has a chemical name, which is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine. And that last word kind of scary to psychiatrists. But, any sophisticated observer of chemistry knows that what's on the molecule matters. And so the base of this is an amphetamine molecule. It actually started as a chemical synthesized by Merck Pharmaceuticals in 1912. And they were looking for an agent that could modify blood clotting. It didn't work out for that use.
Merck never used the drug, and it lingered on the shelf until it was rediscovered by Alexander Shulgin in the 1960s. Shulgin was a pharmacologist and an active explorer of psychedelic drugs. His wife, Anne Shulgin, was a marital therapist, and she began using MDMA in her therapeutic work. She found that it opened up couples to more compassionate, connected states, although it could also bring out darker shadow emotions and fantasies. This early MDMA-assisted therapy that went on in the late 70s and early 80s was a small but legitimate movement for nearly a decade. They formed a professional body, the Association for the Responsible Use of Psychedelic Agents. which held annual meetings and developed guidelines for MDMA-assisted therapy. They grappled with sexual abuse back then by therapists in at least 2 cases where such boundary violations came to light in the early 1980s. Richard Jensen, the therapist who's been accused of sexual misconduct in these MAPS trials, was a pioneer in this early work and presented at those conferences, as was Rick Doblin, the founder of MAPS.
Now, one of the reasons they have 2 therapists in the room is to reduce the risk of boundary violations, because ecstasy is a drug that makes you feel reportedly very connected to other people and plausibly more likely to have sex with them. And having sex with your subjects in a clinical trial is bad and very much against the ethical standards we have to uphold as psychiatrists and therapists to do that. It's a boundary violation, and it can be devastating.
Meanwhile, MDMA was slipping out of the therapy room and into the streets, where it became a popular club drug known as ecstasy or Molly. In 1985, the U.S. government reclassified it as a Schedule I substance with a high potential for abuse and no medical benefits. That classification forced the therapeutic movement to go underground, which it did, and it's estimated that about 60,000 people have been treated with underground MDMA since then. But as soon as the movement went underground, researchers started submitting proposals to the FDA to study the drug. Year after year, each proposal was rejected, until 1992, when the FDA allowed MDMA to be studied for depression and anxiety in patients with terminal cancer. From there, PTSD was a natural next step.
MAPS was founded by a man named Rick Doblin. Rick profoundly believes, after his own experience with MDMA, that this drug and others should be legalized. And the way he chose to advocate for that was through pursuing research into the use of MDMA as a medical treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. So a lot of the people who've been advocating for psychedelic treatments to become medicine have used them before they were. And they had profound experiences and became convinced that they were things that should be pursued. And I wrote a series of articles in which my co-authors and I argue that the evidence actually supports that these may be potentially profoundly different treatments for neuropsychiatric conditions than our historical drugs. So you can be both, have a powerful experience and not be wrong that there's something there. And so it falls to, rigorous science to figure out, well, for whom, in what conditions, are we going to use any of these things? And MDMA is essentially first at bat to go from illegal, bad, capital E drug to medical treatment.
More than most other psychedelics, MDMA creates strong emotional responses, evoking intense feelings of empathy and connection. In that way alone, it reverses one of the most impairing symptoms of PTSD, as the DSM puts it, quote, feelings of detachment or estrangement from others. In MDMA-assisted therapy, the drug is given in 3 dosing sessions, each of which lasts about 6 to 8 hours. During that time, the patient lies on a sofa with headphones or eye mask on and interacts as needed with 2 therapists, 1 man, 1 woman, there are 2 to prevent boundary violations, who act as non-directive guides, supporting the patient in opening up to the new experiences that MDMA brings. Often patients are able to experience trust, connection, and meaning for the first time since that trauma.
So my hunch is that these are neuromodulatory agents that promote the ability to recalibrate our experience and let you learn that your experience wasn't something that you should be persistently fearful of. What I think is happening is that MDMA makes you more able to change your mind. And the mechanism for that is the connection with another human. These therapists, we learn anything through, not some of us learn online, I guess. But we have social trust. Like if we're reading something on the internet, we're not going to learn it and take it into our heart unless we have the trust that we should. And humans create that trust with each other. Peter Fonagy calls this epistemic trust. Trust in social information. And what trauma teaches you is don't learn anything new.
Each dosing session is followed by integration sessions, 9 in total, where the experience of the psychedelic induction is channeled into real-life changes. The integration sessions are also long, about 90 minutes each, and eclectic. The therapy that MAPS presented draws from exposure-based, psychodynamic, Buddhist, existential, and somatic experiencing approaches, among others. It's a standard model, though, if you look at the big picture for psychedelic therapy, creating new experiences and then finding ways to channel them into your life. And similar to psilocybin-assisted therapy for depression and many others. The therapy manual for MAPS is free online. Just Google a manual for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder at maps.org. But what about the evidence? Well, on the surface, MDMA-assisted therapy worked quite well. In 2 randomized phase 3 trials, MDMA-assisted therapy had a large effect size compared to placebo-assisted therapy, about double the effect that we see with SSRIs. 2/3 of these patients no longer met criteria for PTSD at the end of the study. The benefits were durable, documented for several months after the brief 12-session therapy ended. And these were not easy-to-treat patients. Most had severe PTSD that had not responded to medications or therapy. No one flipped into psychosis. No one developed cravings or addictive behaviors around MDMA, which is a street drug. And there were transient increases in blood pressure, which we'd expect. MDMA is an amphetamine derivative, but no cardiovascular events and no cases of overheating or seizures, both of which are known risks with recreational use of MDMA. Now, this is a select population of healthy individuals who didn't have substance use problems, and the studies were small, totaling only 194 patients. But the FDA had already allowed that type of evidence to speed up the approval process as they viewed this as a breakthrough therapy. So why did the FDA panel reject it? And by the way, the FDA has not rejected it. Their advisory panel has. The FDA, which usually it follows the advisory panel, is going to get their final decision in August. Well, boundary violations are part of the reason, but they are not the only one. And the reasons behind this rejection carry broader lessons for psychiatry. We're going to have more on that in next week's episode. Let's end here with a preview of the CME quiz for this episode, which you can take through the link in the show notes. MDMA is a derivative of which psychoactive drug? A. Phenelzine and other MAOIs. B. LSD. C. Amphetamine. D. Mescaline. Dr. Owen Muir is an interventional psychiatrist in New York City and the editor of the newsletter Frontier Psychiatrists, which you can find on Substack. He's got a few recent articles on MDMA, which I highly recommend if you want to go more in depth on this fascinating subject. The Carlat Podcast team is now on video. Find monthly episodes of Carlat Psychiatry News on the Carlat YouTube channel or under webinars on the Carlat webpage. There you'll see Kelly and I along with our newest contributor, Dr. Greg Maltzberg. This month features research on TMS for teens, olanzapine serum levels, a prazosin combo pill for alcohol use, how to switch sleep meds, lithium, omega-3s, and caffeine.
thanks for watching. Hit subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And to earn CMEs for listening, head on over to thecarlatreport.com/podcast.